The galaxy within Warhammer 40K is a place where cosmic horror is as common as starlight. Across the Imperium exist scattered reports and whispered confessions that hint at encounters no sane mind should endure, incidents that were either buried by the Inquisition or lost to the silence of deep space. But some stories refuse to die. They linger like radiation in the hull of an abandoned ship, tales of horrors beyond human understanding that strike without warning, twisting the minds of their victims and erasing entire crews without leaving a single mark. Now, most dismiss these accounts as mere superstition, but an unfortunate few will learn that these stories aren't merely tall tales. They're a warning. Ghost Planet by Stephen Scheel was a short story included in the Warhammer horror anthology The Harrowed Paths, released in early 2021. As always, I implore you to support the original release and have included a link to this anthology down in the description below. Adrift in the void aboard the shattered escort ship The Endless Wrath, 5 survivors desperately cling to existence. With every day that goes by, their chances of being rescued are growing slimmer and slimmer. To make matters worse, their life support systems are failing and their supply of rations growing scarce. To pass the time and stave off madness, they trade ghost stories and void tales. But when a lone engine seer appears with a signal booster, the line between story and reality begins to break down. As paranoia spreads through the ship and the walls seem to close in, each crew member is forced towards an impossible choice: cling to a dwindling, suffocating survival, or gamble everything on a chance. To make matters worse, something out there in the void is watching them with a keen, predatory interest, something ancient and hungry. So come with me, my friends, gather round and listen well as we settle in for another terrifying entry in the Grimdark Story Hour. But before we get into it, a quick shout out to this video's sponsor. I don't know about you, but it feels like I never have enough time for all of the hobbies that I enjoy. Between work, errands, cooking, cleaning, a social life, and at least making a modicum of effort to live a healthy and active lifestyle, there just isn't enough hours in the day. But thankfully, there's the good people over at Factor, the sponsor of today's video, whose gourmet meals make eating healthy easy and give you back many hours of your well-earned free time. Factor saves you a ton of time by eliminating cooking, prepping, cleanup, and trips to the grocery store. Their meals are nutritious, delicious, ready in just 2 minutes, and shipped right to your door. Not only are all of their meals super tasty, but they're all made with the best possible ingredients. They don't use refined seed oils, no refined sugars, just real food. Now, Factor's always had a huge rotating menu, but it's somehow recently doubled in size to over 80+ options with something for everyone. Whether you're focused on a high-protein diet, keto, vegetarian, vegan, or calorie-smart, to name just a few. I love that Factor takes the guesswork out of eating healthy, as no matter how much time you dedicate to that, everybody messes up here or there. Now personally, portion size has always been my Achilles heel, and all too often I will end up accidentally overindulging and messing up my calorie budget. With Factor's meals, I know what I'm getting is both good for me and a normal portion size that leaves me feeling full and ready to take on my day. If you're like me and you want to take control of your nutrition and get back some of your hard-earned free time, then head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code WesHammerFB50 to get 50% off plus free breakfast for 1 year. That's code WesHammerFB50 at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free breakfast for 1 year. Big thanks to Factor for sponsoring this video. "This is the strangest story I ever heard," said Jodrig. He paused and looked from one face to the other, Mandelhan, Oost, and Padrine, while his cracked lips, hidden somewhere behind his gray, thickly matted beard, sucked on one of the stale strips of spiced meat that was close to all that remained of their rations. Oost sat back in her chair and registered his demand for her attention with a single arched eyebrow. Clearly relishing the audience, Jodrig continued. "It was told to me by an old hand on the first ship I ever crewed, a man of great wisdom and experience, a man who had seen all that galaxies had to offer, a man that—"
"For pity's sake, get on with it,"
said Oost. "What's the hurry?" scoffed Padrine. "You can't be worried that we're gonna run out of time."
"The boy's right,"
said Mandelhan, who had worked in the kitchens back when there had been food to cook. She was red-haired and badly fire-scarred on one side of her face, an injury that she wore as though it were a medal. Oost looked at her darkly, resenting her laughter. Mandelhan shrugged.
"We're going nowhere. What's the harm in a tall tale?"
"It's not the tale, it's his way with it,"
said Oost.
He never gets to the point. It grinds my nerves.
Then don't listen,
said Padrine.
Go back to your cabin and your problem is solved.
Oost shifted under their gaze. As much as Jodrig irritated her, it was comforting to be with the others. It helped the time pass more quickly, kept her from thinking too much about the hopelessness of their situation. Better to listen to a tall tale than to the gradually slowing hum of the life support systems. Oost grunted and waved a hand at Jodrig, signaling him begrudgingly to continue. Jodrig nodded, took a moment to suck on the dry meat strip, a habit which Oost had become convinced was solely designed to conjure her irritation, and then resumed.
Now this man, Annandale was his name, a fine man, a worthy man. He told me of a creature. They call it a hollow flea, for it's as small as the head of a pin.
Jodrig held up 2 fingers, with barely any light showing between them to indicate the size.
It lays its eggs in the latrine pipes of a ship. When they hatch, the young seek the closest warm place to grow. And if that happens to be the body of a man...
He sat back in his seat and shook his head.
I've heard this before,
said Padrine.
It's an old slicker's tale, same as all the sanitation crew tell. It's just a way to frighten the new boys, nothing in it. No,
said Jodrig. He leaned forward again, his gaze fixed intently on Padrine.
Then how do you explain what Annandale saw with his very own eyes?
What did he see?
Said Mandelheim. Jodrig's voice lowered. Instinctively, they all drew in a little closer.
A man in Annandale's unit, said Jodrig, became home to one of these bugs. He didn't know it at the time, of course, but others began to notice the change in him. He began to move more sluggishly, as though he was stupefied. He lost all his appetite. Then he began to lose the power of speech, and his skin grew shiny and smooth, as though it had become tighter all over.
They were all silent, listening intently now. As Jodrig paused to take a breath, there was a hollow thud of some piece of flotsam colliding with the ship's hull, like the low toll of a bell.
Finally,
said Jodrig,
one night in the mess hall, he let out a scream that pierced the souls of all that heard it, and he fell jerking to the ground.
With these words, Jodrig slammed the back of his hand down on the table in front of them, twitching his fingers violently to mimic a spasm. Oost felt her heart give a leap and cursed inwardly for allowing herself to be sucked into his tail. Jodrig leaned forward, his voice now little more than a whisper, his eyes wide with sick delight.
Then in front of all of them, his skull split open. From here...
He touched a finger to his hairline, then drew it down his nose to the point of his chin.
To here. And what crawled out?
Jodrig licked his lips with relish.
Had 100 thick legs of flesh and no eyes and a mouth the size of 2 heads. It had eaten the man alive from the inside, bones and organs and muscles and all. So that all that was left of him was his empty skin, like someone had thrown a blanket on the floor, soaked in blood and stinking guts.
There was a moment of silence, and then,
Psh,
said Oost dismissively.
That's it. That's your big story.
It's grim enough for my taste,
said Mandelheim.
I thought it was a fair tale.
Said Padrine.
Better than most I've heard. You know a better one?
Said Jodrig. He fixed his eyes on Oost.
Or are you just here to piss at everyone's porridge?
You want a strange tale?
Said Oost. She rolled up her sleeves and leaned forward on the table.
I'll give you one.
Caden could hear the others talking, but his mind was somewhere else. He stood at the viewing portal of the standby comms deck in what remained of their craft, what once had been a small escort starship named the Endless Wrath. The starfield that stretched out in front of him was unfamiliar. He couldn't find it on any of the maps that had survived the blast, which meant most likely they were drifting somewhere on the edges of charted space. He supposed they should count themselves lucky that they hadn't all been incinerated like the others when the explosion ripped through their ship, that they'd all managed to find their way to this section with its still functioning life support systems, that there was still hope that they might be found. But it had been a long time since the blast now. Rations were dwindling, along with the power they needed to keep the systems working. And being cooped up here, the 5 of them, with barely more than a handful of cabins to hold them, was fraying everyone's nerves. He wondered how much longer they could keep it up.
Bog bills and bullshit.
Jodrig's voice boomed out across from the other end of the large cabin. Caden turned to look at the others. Oost was sitting back in her chair, looking defiant, while Jodrig shook his head in scorn.
You heard this nonsense?
He said to Caden.
I wasn't listening.
said Caden.
I'm sorry. Tell him,
said Padrine.
Caden's the comms rat. He'll know if it's true.
Oost looked over at Caden.
I was warning them of the fireblood scream. A comms man on my previous ship told me about it. The sound that lives, it hides in the frequencies like a disease waiting for silence. And when it finds it...
When it finds it, it fills it, bursting the ears of all who hear it, driving them into a rage of violent insanity. You're saying that it's true?
Said Jodrig. Caden shrugged.
As true as any story you hear out here, I suppose. Once it's passed through the mouths of 100 men, who knows what's real and what isn't?
I've heard it,
said Mandelhan. Everyone turned to look at her. She had taken on a solemn air, like she had been recalling some deep-set trauma.
That sound that, when you hear it, it makes you want to kill? I know that sound.
She looked up at them, and her face was pale, almost haunted. Oost put her hand on Mandelhan's shoulder. Her tone was soft, solicitous.
When did you hear it, Mandelhan?
Mandelhan took a deep breath to set herself, then spoke.
Just now, when Jodrig wouldn't finish his blasted story.
She gave a big grin. Jodrig cursed. The others burst into raucous laughter. Oost took her hand from Mandelhan's shoulder and cuffed her playfully across the head. Caden turned back to the window and smiled to himself. It was good to hear laughter. There had been too little of it over these past days. With the situation they found themselves in, there was little to laugh about. He walked over to the comms console and sat down in front of it, made a routine check of the instruments.
Distress signal still transmitting?
Said Oost. She was hovering over his right shoulder. Caden nodded and tapped one of the instrument dials.
In full range, same as it's always been.
He turned to look up at her and shook his head.
Still nothing.
Oost nodded. Her jaw tightened as she looked at the dial. The distress signal was the only hope they had left. Either they'd be heard and found, or...
What about you, Caden?
Shouted Mandelhan from the table.
You got a story for us? Something to chill the bones?
You ask me. We don't need any more chilling.
Said Padrine. He shivered a little. The life support systems were on minimum levels to conserve energy, and as the days had gone by, it felt like the coldness of space was creeping ever closer to them. Jodrig scoffed.
You think this is cold? When I was on that fine old battle barge, the Iron Fist of Strength, the systems went down one time, and we had...
Oh, bite your tongue, Jodrig. We don't need another fireblood scream out of you.
Said Oost. She turned back to the comms man.
So, Caden, you have a tale worth the telling?
Caden looked from one expectant face to another. Out of somewhere in the depths of his memory came a single word.
Volgast,
he said.
Volgast?
Said Oost.
Is that a man or a beast or...
It's a place, or so they say.
Said Caden.
The truth be told, I've heard others call it different. Maybe it's just a word for something that there's no other word for.
Even as he spoke, he wasn't sure why he'd said the name, for even thinking of it made him uneasy. It had been one of the first tales he had heard as a young boy, taking his position aboard the Sharpasian, a Class II mining vessel. A tale told to him by his bunkmate, an old hand named Bixen, and one which had lingered long in his mind, though it had been nearly half a lifetime since he last thought of it. He glanced toward the viewing portal and wondered if the fear of all that unknowable space that surrounded them had pricked his memory.
There are planets out there amongst the stars, invisible to scans, invisible to the eyes of humans. Planets made up of the souls of the dead, where ancient evil spirits rule. Now, these spirits seek out passing crafts in order to steal from them new souls to populate their worlds, ever desiring to add to the endless, agonizing cries of those that they have claimed. This Volgast is one of these worlds, at least so I was told. A ghost planet drifting in space, moored to no orbit, undetectable. A place whose true horror you can only see once you've passed across the threshold of death, when your soul leaves behind its body and it's sucked down to join the billion others in their eternal torment. As Caden finished speaking, he was aware that a silence had settled around him. He looked up at the faces that surrounded him. The others looked pensive, their good humor replaced by a solemn introspection, as though something in his words had sucked away any entertainment that lay in their tale-telling. How do they claim you?
Said Padrine, his voice quiet and low.
These spirits.
Well, no one knows, said Caden. Not really. But some say that their trick is to enter a man's mind and turn his thoughts so that an easeful death comes to seem preferable to enduring the pain of living. His words felt like a blast of chill air over them all. Since they had found themselves stranded all those long days ago, the thought of death had been ever present. So perilous was their situation, but it was one that they had each in their own way found a method of stifling so as to allow them to continue to pass their days. Now that thought lay heavy in the air, and the thick shell of metal that contained them and kept them from the cold infinity of space seemed suddenly gossamer thin. Mandelhan clapped her hands together and stood up, breaking the morbid spell.
See,
She said to Caden.
this is why no one ever asked to drink with you.
She gave a wink to the others.
Now, I'm going to retire to my cabin and try not to think about impending death. Who's got first watch?
Caden lay on his bunk and looked at the ceiling. He was alone, as were most all the remaining crew. Another crew member's uniform still hung in the closet, but Caden tried not to think about whose bed he now slept in. What had happened to them? Boiled alive in the explosion when the ship had first been ruptured by the warp storm? Crushed by walls that imploded in the sudden decompression? Or floated for long moments outside the ship's hull, gasping for a last impossible breath? He turned onto his side. He wished he had never spoken about the ghost planet. It had put a pall across everything, turned the mood of the others just at the point where they had found some small respite from the hopelessness of their situation. Why had he done it? It was hard to say, except that their confinement and the desperateness of their situation did strange things to a man's thoughts, sometimes without him even realizing. He put the incident from his mind, tried to force himself to just give in to sleep, but just as he was drifting out of wakefulness, as he felt his taut muscles finally relaxing, a strident blast of sound filled the room.
All crew to the comms room.
Came Oost's voice across the channels.
All crew to the comms room immediately.
Caden leapt from his bed and rushed to the door. Could it be a rescue? Some passing ship noting their predicament? Or had one of the repair jobs they'd done to patch up this floating section failed? Were they now to be plunged into the final emergency? When he reached the comms room, the others were already there, crowding around the viewing portal. Oost was at the front, looking intently at the glass, holding her arms outstretched to quiet the others.
Keep watching.
She was saying, quietly but firmly.
Keep watching.
Caden joined the others, looking out at the vast starfield that lay in front of them. There was nothing there. No ships, no debris, no obvious danger. Then, thud. A hand smacked against the glass from outside. Caden felt his heart jump. The hand was clad in a thick glove from a maintenance suit. There was someone out there. "How do we know it's not just a body?" said Padrine. "How do we know if—" But even as he spoke, the hand raised itself and came down again on the glass. Then a helmet came into view, and though no light shone on the face inside, it was clear that whoever was inside the suit was looking in on them.
It's another survivor,
Said Caden.
Impossible,
Said Jodrek.
Why?
Said Mandelhan.
We survived, didn't we? Or maybe he was in another part of the ship. We don't know what happened to the rest of the craft. Maybe there are more of them out there.
The hand came again. Thud.
Or the quickest way to find out is to get them inside.
Said Caden.
Jodrek, you were a hull rat. You know your way around better than anyone. You want to take the lead on retrieval?
Everyone looked at Jodrek. Taking trips outside the ship had been his daily grind for 30 years or more, but he shook his head.
We don't know who that is, or what they want from us. You want to split rations between 6 of us now? You want to add another set of lungs to suck down this air?
We can't just leave them outside.
Said Mandelhan.
If you won't go, I will.
She pushed past him towards the airlock. Jodrek grabbed her arm.
I tell you, you're making a mistake.
Mandelhan glared and yanked her arm away.
That's his maybe.
She said.
Won't be the first time.
As she walked off, Jodrek called out to her.
Aye, but it may well be your last.
The 5 of them stood in a semicircle, looking at the survivor, waiting for her story.
My name.
She said. Her voice was hoarse and croaking, as though she was unused to speaking. She coughed, wiped her lips with the back of her hand, then started again.
My name is Voll. I'm an engine seer. From Deck 5, I thought
She swallowed again, wetting her throat.
I was the only survivor. I was trapped in another part of the ship back that way.
She pointed to the damaged transit corridor that Jodrek and Padrine had blocked off during those first desperate hours to gain stability for the craft.
But there was no way through. When my life support system started running low, I decided to go outside. See if I can make it to another part of the ship, one that was still stable.
She looked up at them now, and the edge of a smile was on her face.
I never expected to find all of you.
She was a tall, gangling woman with a long, pale face and hair cropped close to her scalp. None of them ever remembered seeing her before, but that was no surprise. There had been hundreds on board this craft originally, and grunts like them generally kept to their own crew class.
You got food? Rations?
Said Padrine, eyeing the strongbox that Voll had been carrying with her on her jaunt. Voll shook her head.
I'm sorry, no. I ran out 2 days ago.
Jodrig gave a dark laugh.
So you'll be wanting some of ours then?
He looked at the others.
Just like I warned you, but you wouldn't listen. Just old Jodrig talking his nonsense, eh?
Oost flashed a look at him, and the old man gave a grunt and turned away. Oost nodded at the strongbox.
So what's inside?
I thought it might help,
Said Voll. She unlocked the box, pulled out what looked like a metal tube wrapped in a coil, dangling with cables at one end and fixed with a switch at the other.
if I could find a working comms unit.
A signal booster, said Caden, who recognized the object immediately.
Yes,
Said Voll.
I couldn't use it where I was. The comms unit was destroyed in the crash, but I thought if I could find a way to broadcast a rescue signal, and I attached this.
It had increased the range 100-fold, said Caden. The others looked at him with hope flickering in their eyes.
You mean,
Said Mandelhahn.
we just need to attach this to the comms unit, and then we...
Caden held up a hand to stop her. It's not that simple. With these units, they draw a lot of power. If we attach it, it will mean... He hesitated. He was running all the scenarios through his mind.
Mean what?
Said Oost.
It'll drain the life support systems.
Said Voll.
It'll cut the time you have left by 2/3, maybe more.
Her words hit him like a blow to the gut. The only thing that might give them a better chance of rescue might also increase their risk of dying.
That's cruel.
Said Oost.
That's a choice straight out of the warp.
We should do it.
Said Mandelhahn with conviction. They all turned to look at her. She shrugged.
We all know we're just counting down the hours and days until we die. At least this gives us a chance.
No,
Said Padrine.
the time's what we need. The longer we can stay alive, the better the odds on us being found. We hook that thing up,
He pointed at the device that Voll held.
and we're signing our own death warrants. The boy's right.
Said Jodrig.
We'd be fools to drain so much power.
We'd be fools not to try it.
Said Mandelhahn.
It might be our only hope.
It's too big of a risk.
Said Oost, shaking her head. Mandelhahn laughed.
I never knew I bunked with such a congregation of cowards.
She said. The others bristled at the insult, but Mandelhahn turned her attention to Caden.
You're the comms expert. Where do you stand?
Caden reached down, took the device from Voll, and looked it over. We don't even know if it works.
So test it. Hook it up and find out.
Said Mandelhahn.
If it does what she says it'll do, then we got a choice. We can turn it on and take our chances, or
She said, looking back at the others.
we can die slowly and painfully, because none of us ever had the guts to take a risk.
Jodrig threw his heavy boots into the corner of his cabin, where they clattered against the metal. Anger brewed and bubbled in him, like a cauldron on a furnace top.
Coward, am I?
He muttered. The very mention of the word fired his blood. He had been through more than the likes of Mandelhahn ever had, more than she could hope to live through in 10 lifetimes. He'd proved himself over and over, knew in his heart that he had courage, he had strength, he had resilience. He knew what kind of man he was. He was scared of nothing, nothing that lived or breathed, or an image flashed in his mind, and he shook his head, as though trying to dislodge a hook.
No, not now.
Not that. He stood up from his bunk and paced the small cabin. He was right. He knew that. The signal booster would be too much of a risk. They were taking a chance even letting Voll inside the craft, cutting down their share of rations and using up more air. They'd have been better off leaving her outside, leaving her to... Again, the image came, and this time it lodged in his mind. A memory. The day of the warp storm. The day the ship had been destroyed. Gregov's face behind his cracked visor. Jodrig sat down heavily on the end of his bunk and rubbed his heavy, thick fingers over his face, feeling the scratch of his beard against his skin. He pressed the pads of his thumbs against his eyelids like a mask, but the image was still there, lurking behind them. Jodrig had been on a routine maintenance assignment on the day of the storm, repairing a crack in the hull's surface. Gregov had been his second, a tool carrier linked to Jodrig's void suit by a thick umbilical cord. It had been a task they had undertaken 1,000 times, and 1,000 times before, it had passed without danger. But the day the warp storm hit, with no warning, no chance to prepare, when the fabric of space itself seemed to rip open and tear apart anything in its reach, Jodrig and Gregov could do nothing but watch and try to survive. Jodrig had desperately grabbed for a handhold on the hull, his fingers finding the crevice of an opening at the edge of an access hatch, allowing him to brace himself against the ship. But as he turned to see whether Gregov had found a similar anchor, he found himself almost yanked away from his place of safety. Gregov was floating behind him at the end of a taut umbilical cord, the waves of the warp storm twisting and bursting behind him. Jodrig tried to pull him closer, but the effort needed was more than he could spare, not without losing his own grip on the hull. Instead, he could only watch as the cracks that had appeared on Gregov's visor began to multiply and spread, crisscrossing the glass like a web, until finally the whole surface exploded, sending shards of the faceplate flying and exposing Gregov to the ice-cold airlessness of space. For a moment, there was only shock and surprise on Gregov's face, then a flash of horror at the realization of what was to come. Jodrig saw Gregov's lips open, expelling his final breath of air. At the same time, Gregov's face began to swell and deform, the flesh around his eyes bulging and distorting as his neck began to distend, swiftly growing to almost twice its width. With no shielding against the energies of the warp storm, Gregov's skin began to blister and darken, like meat against a grill, then melt away completely, revealing the bloated and bloody flesh beneath. The thing that had most horrified Jodrig, though, were his eyes, which showed every moment of pain, every escalation of agony. It was too much for Jodrig to bear. With his free hand, he pulled the lever which released his end of the umbilical cord and watched as Gregov's body was pulled away from him into the depths of the storm, his bulbous, skinned lips gasping for a next breath that would never come. Jodrig sat up straight, turned his face to the cabin ceiling, and sucked in a lungful of thin, stale air. His body was trembling at the memory of Gregov's last suffocating moments. He was lying to himself when he said there was nothing he feared, for the prospect of succumbing to Gregov's fate terrified him to his core. A single corridor linked the cabins with the doors to the comms room, and Pedrine paced the length of it from one end to the other like a guard on sentry duty, his boots pounding out a regular drumbeat on the metal floor. Da-dun, da-dun, da-dun. A turn on his heels at the closed door, and then he walked back again. Da-dun, da-dun. Focusing his mind on the sound and the movement of his body, blocking out the other thoughts that were trying to crowd in. Jodrig's right was the thought that was hovering around him. We should never have let her in. He had nothing against Voll, he didn't even know her, but the last thing they needed was another body on board. It wasn't just the rations or the life support systems, it was the lack of space. Ever since the explosions, which had ruptured and torn apart the ship, when the 5 of them had been forced into this patched up section of the craft, the sense of claustrophobia had been growing in him. He hated to be cooped up like this, kept like an animal in a cage, or like a prisoner. He stopped walking, put his hand against the wall beside him. That was the savage irony of his survival from the storm that had wrecked the ship. The ruptures that had torn the fabric of the craft asunder had also freed him from his containment in the brig, where he'd languished for several long months. Just the memory of the cell in which he had been held was enough to bring out a sweat on his brow. 4 cramped walls, no room to lie down, barely room to sit, just his own mind for company. It had been enough to drive a man mad. And for what? Because he had taken a blade to that fool Tunt, carved him a new face full of holes, taught him that Pedrine was the butt of no man's joke? Of course, he hadn't planned to kill Tunt, but in his enthusiasm to teach the man a lesson, he'd been careless with a knife and severed an artery. When they'd found the 2 of them, Pedrine was covered in Tunt's blood, and the other man was gasping like a banked fish. Even though Pedrine tried to convince them of his true intentions, there was no doubt that he was to blame. Now, none of the others knew this, of course. When he found himself free from his confinement and made his way along the collapsing corridors towards the comms room, he was just hoping to survive. And when he found the others and they put all their efforts into securing that section of the craft, there really hadn't been time to talk. It was only later, when their immediate survival had been secured, that they began to share their stories. And then it was easy for Padrine to just omit his recent history of confinement. For what good would it really do for them to know, if it came down to it, that they needed to sacrifice someone for the sake of their survival, to make the rations or the life support systems last just a little bit longer? Then why give them any reason to pick him? He began to walk again, and as he walked, he felt in his pocket for the knife. It wasn't the same one that he had used on Tunt. That had been taken from him, but it was a good enough blade nonetheless. If it came down to it, as it surely would in these coming days, then he wanted to make sure that he was near the top of the pecking order for survival. And if that meant taking care of one of the others, then he was ready to do what had to be done. There was no brig to hold him now, after all, and no one to stop him.
Are you awake?
Said Mandelhan. Oost was turned away from her on the bunk that they shared, but Mandelhan could sense that she was not yet sleeping. Something about the way that she held her body, muscles tight as though in anticipation. Oost made a sound, neither a yes or a no, barely more than a grunt, and turned onto her back. She opened her eyes, stared at the ceiling for a moment, and then turned to Mandelhan.
You have something to say, or are you gonna tell me I'm a coward once again?
She scoffed and shook her head.
Or is it a fool this time?
You're neither a coward nor a fool,
said Mandelhan.
but you're more stubborn than any woman I've ever met.
Why? Because I won't take a needless risk that could damn us all?
Because you won't listen to reason, even when it's in your best interest. This device that Voll has, it could be our only hope.
Or it could kill us all?
Said Oost.
It's a chance we have to take.
Said Mandelhan.
Can't you see that?
Oost sat up on the bunk. In the dimness of the room, her eyes were just two glints of light, but they were bright, unwavering, defiant.
If you're in a hurry to die,
she said,
there are quicker ways to get there.
Mandelhan held Oost's gaze for a long moment. There was going to be no convincing her. She swung her legs over the side of the bunk and stood up. As she reached the door and grasped the handle, she looked back at the other woman.
Whether you die quickly or die slowly, you leave the same corpse,
she said. Voll stood at the viewing portal, looking out at the stars beyond, her head tilted to one side as though examining the detail of a painting. As Caden emerged from beneath the comms desk, she turned to him and gave the same crease of a smile as before.
Is it working?
She said. Caden grabbed a tool from the desk.
It'll take a while longer,
he said.
The whole craft was in a bad way when we first got here. We had to do a lot of patching up. Nothing's ever as simple as it looks.
But you can do it,
said Voll.
You can fit the booster?
I can do it,
said Caden.
but I can't warrant that the others will want to turn it on.
They don't trust me,
said Voll. It was said as a blank statement of fact.
They're afraid.
They have a lot to be afraid of, said Caden. It's been a tough stretch, being stranded here all these long days. Does things to a mind, awakens superstition, sets nerves afire.
He looked at Voll, a curious crease in his brow.
How did you manage it? Out there alone all that time? Not even a crewmate to talk to? How did it not drive you to insanity?
Voll uttered a dark laugh.
I'm not sure it didn't,
she said.
You seem sane enough to me,
said Caden.
At least no less sane than the rest of us.
I'll tell you something,
said Voll.
When I first came across this section of the craft and looked in through the glass and saw you all gathered here, you want to venture what my first thought was?
She lowered her voice, almost to a whisper.
That you were all ghosts, beckoning me to my death.
Caden gave a short laugh.
That's no surprise,
he said.
I've half wondered myself if we weren't already dead.
Jodrick sat bootless on the floor, his right arm stretching into the gap between the heavy bunk and the wall. He strained to reach further, felt his fingertips touch the cold glass he was looking for. He fumbled to grasp it, felt it totter for a moment out of his touch, and readied the mother of all curses on his lips. Then, the bottle fell towards him again, and he clasped it tightly in his palm, before drawing it out and holding it up to the light. A bottle of Amasec, a cheap but potent brew, the only alcohol left on board the craft. He'd found it on the first day after the ship's destruction, when they were inventorying their rations, and had managed to keep it hidden from the others ever since. In the early days, he'd taken a glug or two every evening, just to keep his spirits on an even keel. But as the weeks had worn on, he'd seen the bottle grow emptier and emptier. He decided to ration himself, and had interred the bottle in its hiding place behind the bunk as a means of staving off temptation. But now, with the memories of Gregov still swirling around his head, he needed a taste to quiet his nerves. There was perhaps a finger of the golden liquid left in the bottle, and Jodrek was torn between the desire to gulp it down immediately or eke it out for as long as possible. He uncorked the bottle, raised it to his mouth, and as soon as he felt the alcohol touch his lips, he knew that he would not be able to resist his first impulse. He drank it down in 3 large gulps, relishing the fieriness of it as it coated his tongue and slid down his throat, closing his eyes in satisfaction as the heat hit his belly. He opened his eyes and licked his lips, seeking out every last taste of the liquid, cradling the empty bottle in his lap as though it were the dead body of a beloved pet. As the last faint specks of alcohol mingled with his saliva, he saw the cabin lights flicker, heard a buzz of energy all around him, and then the room went dark. In the comms room, Voll's silhouette stood out against the starfield beyond the viewing portal.
What's happening?
She said in the darkness.
Is there a problem? Is it the signal booster?
No, said Caden from beneath the desk. No fault of mine. It's the power cells. They're on a cycle. It happens every night, a way to conserve energy. They'll be back on again in a short time. He took the torch out from his pocket, went back to work, and hoped that it was true. With the lights out in his cabin, the only illumination came from the small round viewport which sat low on the wall opposite of Jodrek. A circle of stars slowly rotated within the frame of the window as the craft drifted and turned, pinpricks of light glowing against the infinite blackness. Jodrek watched the stars turn as the warmth of the amasec faded in his belly, and the alcohol began to work on his senses, making him feel as though he were slipping into a dream. For a moment, he wondered about the darkness, wondered what it meant, if he should be worried. Then, something appeared, floating out there in front of the gleaming stars, something which robbed his mind of any other thought. Jodrek's heart jumped, and he scrambled quickly on all fours across the cabin floor, dragging the empty amasec bottle with him as he went. He pulled himself up to place his nose against the viewport and looked out. The figure of a man was floating out past the ship, a corridor's length away from him, but still close enough for Jodrek to know instantly who it was. Jodrek's throat dried. He put a hand to his eyes to rub them clear, looked again. The man still hung there, suspended against the starfield. Gregov. It couldn't be. Too many days had passed since the storm. The damaged craft had drifted far from where Gregov had died. His body had been moving away from the ship when Jodrek last saw it. How could it be back here now? But here it was, regardless. Jodrek recognized his friend's void suit, saw the long umbilical cord still attached, now hanging useless. And even from this distance, he could see Gregov's face, flesh stripped almost to the bone. The eyes melted away into dark, empty sockets. The yellow teeth exposed and set in a mocking rictus grin, the face that had been branded on his memory forever. Those last moments came back to him again now. Gregov gasping for air, his eyes pleading with Jodrek for some kind of help. Jodrek, terrified for his own life, releasing the cord. Jodrek pushed himself away from the viewport, scrambling back across the floor until he could no longer see the floating corpse of his friend. As his back hit the far wall, he realized that he was struggling to find his own breath, as though the air in the room had grown thin. A fear came over him. What if this was it? The lights going out, the life support systems failing. What if this was the end? What if Gregov's body was a sign of what was to come for him? His heart was pumping hard against his chest. He could feel the panic rising. He sucked in one breath after another, but none seemed to fill his lungs. He crawled over to the cabin door, pressed the button to open it, but nothing happened. He pulled himself up to his knees and tried to yank the handle, but it wouldn't budge. This was it, he told himself. The craft was on lockdown, systems failing, oxygen levels falling. It might be only a matter of minutes before he was dead. He looked again towards the viewport, saw Gregov's corpse even closer now, saw the twisted and agonized grin on the near skeletal face. The thought of a slow, suffocating death terrified him. He couldn't stand to die that way. There had to be something better, something cleaner, quicker. He felt the empty bottle in his hand and knew what he had to do. He swung it hard against the door, smashing away the bottom of the vessel, leaving a ragged, sharp edge. As he lifted the broken bottle to his throat, he was glad he'd drunk the amasec down in one. It might help ease the pain. As Gregov's corpse looked on from the window, Jodrek plunged the jagged edge into his throat and tore. Padrine was in the store when the lights went out. He knew the place almost inch by inch. As part of the supplies crew, it had been his duty to do so. But still, it disconcerted him. In the darkness, every walkway felt narrower, every wall closer. He felt for the torch on his belt, but his fingers met an empty pouch. "Throne preserve us," he muttered to himself, What kind of fool goes without a torch? He walked slowly now, minding his step. On entering the store, his aim had been to reach the furthest compartment, the one that held the 100 stacks of empty ration tins, all surplus to their requirements and therefore ignored by the others. It had been the place where he had secreted away the last las pistol to be found aboard the ship, hidden away precisely for a time like this, when a firm hand may be needed to steer the group away from a ruinous path. The more he considered it, the more suspicious he felt of Voll, the more certain he was that she possessed some malevolent agenda. The others were too trusting, especially that fool, Caden, a by-the-book man if he had ever seen one. If they weren't careful, she'd have them all going along with her lunatic plan. Drain the ship of power? It was madness, and he'd need to show them that. He took a step forward and stumbled. As he righted himself, he felt a tug on his ankle, something tightening around the bone. Reaching down, he felt something entangled around his boot, a stretch of cable, his fingers told him, and firmly nodded. He cursed to himself, then crouched down and worked his fingertips in between the taut rolls. He didn't know how many long minutes it took him to finally get his foot free, but by the end of his efforts, he was sweating hard, and his head was pounding with the closeness of the air around him. All he wanted to do now was find the las gun and get out of this dark and airless closet. He stood up quickly, went to move away, but then his foot slipped on a loose strip of cable, and all of a sudden, he was thrust forward, off balance, and scrambling for a handhold. His face hit a smooth, solid surface. He felt his nose crack and break, warm blood spattering his cheeks. At the same time, there was a loud bang behind him, and something hard hit him in the back. When he tried to turn, he found that he was trapped. With rising panic, he shifted his body round between close walls to face back the way he'd fallen. He reached up his hands and felt smooth metal in front of him. He was in a container locker, one of the ones they'd already emptied of gear. It was barely bigger than the size of a man. His hands scrambled around the door of the locker, searching for some kind of latch or handle, but there was none. When he tried to push against the metal, bracing his back against the rear of the space, his hands found no give. It was as though there was no door at all, just a solid, impenetrable set of walls all around him. He was sweating even harder now, and feeling his breath growing short and more rapid as he struggled to find some hint of a crack in the walls that surrounded him. Memories flashed back into his mind, being locked in his cell day after day, his legs cramped, his body aching, and now, somehow, he found himself in a situation that was even worse, even more intolerable. He battered his fist against the door and the walls, but the thick metal sent back only dull sounds, and he knew the others wouldn't hear him, especially as he'd closed the store cabin door as to not arouse suspicion when he retrieved the las gun. Unless someone came into the cabin, it would be hours before they found him. Long hours confined in this space, trapped in this airless coffin. The thought terrified him, and he felt his mind boiling to a frenzy. He couldn't stand it, couldn't make it through. It was too much to bear. He had to rid himself of the thought, drive it from his mind. He bent his head back and slammed his temple down into the metal door. Bright stars sparked behind his eyes, and pain shot through him, for that moment, obliterating everything else. All thought, all memory. Bracing his arms against the door, he threw his head forward again, harder this time, then again and again, until blood coated his face and he could feel the bones of his temple begin to crack. Over and over again, he beat his head against the metal until there was nothing left but blood, broken bone, and oblivion. Mandelhan sat up in her bunk. She was in the cabin beside the storeroom, the one they'd been using as a Medicaid ward, where she'd been since her argument with Oost. There was a banging coming from somewhere, a sound like a steady, ominous drumbeat. For a moment, she thought it might be Padrine again, with his interminable pacing up and down the corridors. But this sound was duller, further away, like it was being transmitted through the very metal of the ship. Something in the sound disturbed her, but she didn't know why. She listened again for the sound, heard it once, twice, 3 times, and then no more. In the silence, it came to her, the memory, the tale her father had told her of the great and terrible warrior, felled on the battleground, supposed dead and given a warrior's burial, only to be heard days later, pounding his fist against the coffin that held him. Caden came out from beneath the comms desk, shuffling on his back in the darkness, the torch held between his teeth. The light hit Voll full in the face as he emerged.
Done?
She asked. Caden turned the torch so that it was out of her eyes. Oh, yes, he said.
The signal booster is functional? You've tested it?
Asked Voll.
It works perfectly.
said Caden. Voll nodded.
Then we should call the others. Tell them it's time to make their choice.
Perhaps we should wait, said Caden, until the power cells come. Even as he spoke, there was a buzz and a flicker, and the lights on the ship came on again. Caden blinked his eyes against the sudden illumination.
You must be some kind of sorcerer,
said Voll. Caden gave a grunt.
More cursed than conjurer,
he said. He looked at the switch, which was now affixed to the comms unit.
Before we bring the others in,
he said.
There's something...
A yell came from the corridor outside the comms room.
Caden!
As Caden and Voll turned to the sound, they saw Mandelhan in the doorway. Her hands were smeared in blood.
It's Padrine.
Padrine's body lay on the floor in the supplies cabin, his feet still inside the metal cabinet where Mandelhan had found him. His lifeless face, nose broken, eyes swollen and dark, his forehead a crater of blood, pulped flesh and fragments of broken bone peering up at them.
That's where he fell when I opened the door,
said Mandelhan.
There's blood smeared inside the cabinet, front and back. Some frenzy he must have been in.
He did this to himself? Said Caden. Mandelhan nodded.
By all appearances.
Caden crouched to look closer at Padrine's face. Blood was congealed around the bone fragments that jutted from his forehead.
Something was inside his head,
said Caden, almost to himself.
Something he couldn't get out.
It's not just him,
said a voice from the door. The three of them turned to see Oost. She was shifting nervously from foot to foot, her eyes hovering over Voll.
There's something deadly come aboard this craft.
The blood that pooled from the ragged hole in Jodrig's neck spread from his body almost to the door where they stood, its surface glinting with the reflection of the overhead lights, like stars twinkling in a dark pool. Its stench of plasma and amasecond death thick in the stale air around them.
What could drive a man to do such a thing?
Said Mandelhan.
To harm himself in that way.
Perhaps it was the drink,
said Voll.
Many have been ruined by it. If it finds you in a black mood, it can drive you down to the depths of...
It's not drink that's done this,
said Oost, cutting her off.
Same as it wasn't drink done for Padrine.
She was staring hard at Voll, her hands still clasping and unclasping as though preparing to make a leap.
It's you.
The others looked at Oost with confusion.
Voll has not been out of my sight these past hours, said Caden. There's no chance she could have had any part of this.
Oost let out a hollow laugh.
You don't know what she is, do you? You haven't discerned it yet. Not even you, Caden.
You need to start speaking sense,
said Mandelhan.
We're not telepaths.
Oost wiped a hand over her mouth. She was sweating, nervous, her eyes never leaving Voll.
She's a spirit,
she said.
One of those ancient ones from the ghost planet.
She lifted her hand to point a finger in Voll's face.
Volgast,
she hissed.
There's no such thing as spirits,
said Mandelhan, her face blanching at Oost's suggestion.
That's a heathen notion.
Voll laughed, shook her head.
You're losing your wits,
she said.
Same as these others.
Oost ignored her.
She's here to take our souls,
she said.
Take them down with her to the planet.
With a sudden movement, she went past them over to the viewport, her feet making treads in Jodrig's blood. She peered through the glass into the darkness beyond.
It's out there somewhere, close by. It's how she was able to come to us. There's no other part of the ship that survived the blast. It's all a lie, a tall tale to make us trust her. And this bullshit about a signal boost.
The laugh burst from her like a shot.
It's just a way to get us to kill ourselves, to get inside our heads. Same way she did Jodrig, same way she did Padrine.
She turned from the window, looked angrily at Caden and Mandelhan.
Can't you see it?
Mandelhan shook her head, looked pityingly at Oost.
That was just a tale,
she said softly, as though speaking to a child.
There's no planet, and she's no spirit.
She nodded over at Voll.
She's flesh and blood, same as you. And she's not here to kill us. She's given us a chance to survive, and it's a chance I think we should take, before this damn confinement makes lunatics of us all.
She turned to Caden.
Is it ready? The signal booster?
Yes, said Caden, but Mandelhan cut him off.
Then we switch it on. Agreed?
No!
Yelled Oost fiercely. She glowered at Mandelhan.
You'll touch that switch over my dead body.
For a moment, the two of them stood, eyes locked in mutual defiance. Then Mandelhan turned, bolted, and ran. As her figure disappeared from sight, moving towards the comm room, Oost let out a savage, manic scream and ran after her. As she passed, Caden tried to grab her arm and pull her back, but Oost shoved him hard in the chest, sending him slamming against the wall. His feet slipped in Jodrig's blood. As Caden hit the floor and felt the still warm, half-congealed liquid smear across his face, he yelled out a desperate cry. "Don't!" Mandelhond reached the comms room and ran for the desk. But even as she reached out her arm for the switch that would activate the signal booster, she felt a thud in her shoulder and an agonizing pain went through her. She fell to her knees, reached up her hand, and felt the knife that was embedded there. Oost was in the doorway, pulling another knife from her belt. She glanced behind her as she saw Caden and Voll running down the corridor towards her, then slammed her fist into the control panel, locking the door shut behind her. With a rising moan of pain, Mandelhond wrenched the knife from her back. Thick drops of blood hit the cabin floor, and she felt a dryness in her throat. She had only minutes, she knew, before the loss of blood would make her too weak to carry on.
"Move away from the desk,"
said Oost.
"I don't want to hurt you."
Mandelhond looked up, saw the resolve in Oost's eyes, saw the clean blade in her hand. Slowly, she stood up, wiped her own blood from the knife onto the thigh of her uniform, and turned to face her. Caden pounded his fist against the door of the comms room. "Oost!" he yelled. "Mandelhond!" He stabbed a finger against the control panel, but the door was jammed shut. He spun around to look at Voll, who stood behind him. "Help me, for throne's sake! Help me!" Mandelhond and Oost circled each other, each holding their combat knife in front of them, each waiting for the other to make a move. With every step that Mandelhond took, new smears of blood appeared on the floor beneath her feet. Her uniform was soaked from the wound in her back, and she could feel a coldness beginning to spread across her body. She wanted to say something to Oost, something that would quell her paranoia, something that would make her see that they had to take this chance, that nothing but madness awaited them otherwise. But looking into Oost's eyes, she could see that the time for talking was past. Whatever fragile bond they had shared before now as survivors, it had been severed, and there was no going back. As they moved around each other, Mandelhond saw Oost's eyes flick over towards the comms desk where the signal booster sat, searching for a way to disable it for good. In that instant, she lunged forward, thrust her blade deep into Oost's torso, feeling the hilt push up against the flesh as the tip of the blade hit bone. Oost let out a gasp, and her free hand grasped at Mandelhond's back, pulling her in close as though in an embrace. At the same time, Mandelhond felt Oost's blade plunge into her stomach, the serrated edge tearing a ragged split in her gut. The smell of her own exposed intestines hit her nose, and she gagged. For a moment, the two of them stood locked together, eyes only inches apart, their blood mingling and spilling onto the cabin floor. A word seemed to hang on Oost's lips, but as the breath came to speak it, her eyes grew dim, and the weight of her body pulled them both to the floor with a crash. When Caden and Voll finally forced the door open, Mandelhond and Oost were both already dead, their bodies entangled on the cabin floor, their hands still holding the blades that sat deep in the other's body, making them seem like one single twin-headed entity. Caden stared at the bodies for a long time, while Voll watched on, silently observing the agonies of thought which seemed to be traversing the taut muscles of his face. Finally, Caden walked over to the comms desk and placed his hands on either side of the switch, his head bowed as though in silent contemplation.
"I'm sorry for your crewmates,"
said Voll after a time. Caden nodded, keeping his head bowed, his eyes on the switch. Without seeming to hear her footsteps, Caden felt Voll step forward to stand against the viewing portal beside him.
"The decision still remains,"
she said quietly.
"The choice."
Caden took a deep breath and turned to her. "There is no choice," he said. "All of this." He gestured to the bodies of Mandelhond and Oost. "Jodrig and Padrine, too. It was all for nothing." He pointed to the switch. "Your device works exactly as it should. Yes, but..." He turned to look at her. His face was ashen with guilt. "There is no distress signal for it to boost. There never has been." A silence hung between them for a moment.
"You lied to them,"
said Voll finally. "There had to be some hope," said Caden. "We had nothing else. What should I have done? Told them the truth? That we were doomed from the very moment we came aboard this craft? That only a miracle could save us?" Voll nodded at the bodies on the floor.
"That's what hope did to them."
"No," said Caden. "That's what you did to them with your damned device. It drove them mad, made them lose their minds." He looked at Voll, his eyes cold with anger. "Jodrig was right. We should never have brought you aboard this ship. All you have brought is misery. All you have brought is..." The words died on his tongue, and he looked away.
"All I offered was a choice,"
said Voll quietly.
"That's all I've ever done."
With Vol's help, Caden moved the bodies of Jodrig and Pedrine into the comms room and laid them out next to Mandelhan and Oost. He covered them in sheets and muttered a ritual prayer for their souls, such as he could remember. Then, one by one, he put them into the airlock and opened it, sending their corpses into the airless depths of space. At the very least, he said to Vol as he stood at the door to the airlock, I can vouch that I got them off this prison of a ship. That if nothing else.
I know that you mark yourself responsible for what befell them,
said Vol.
But what's done is done, and there's no use in brooding on it now. And in truth, the result of their sacrifice means that we now have more rations to share between us, and more oxygen too. Even if hope of rescue is slim, we have a little more chance now. Isn't that something to be grateful for?
Grateful, said Caden. No. A curious look came over his face, as though something in his thoughts was crystallizing. No, I won't be grateful for what they did, for their derangement and their delusions. I won't make my life on top of the bones of their madness. I should have told them the truth. I own that, but I'll be damned if I'm going to spend my last living days sucking down air that should have been theirs.
What, then, do you propose to do?
Said Vol. Caden looked at the airlock. Make my own choice, he said. Caden stood in the airlock and listened as the inner compartment door closed behind him. He faced the outer door, beyond which lay the vastness of space. He was ready. He had been since he had seen the bodies of Mandelhan and Oost, Jodrig and Pedrine, all laid out in front of him. They'd been through the worst of times together, the five of them, and they'd stay together now. He looked back through the window of the inner door and gave a nod to Vol, a signal to open the hatch. She nodded back and disappeared from view. Caden took a last breath and then watched as the two sides of the door slid apart and the star-flecked darkness appeared before him. With a rush of air, Caden was sucked out past the doors of the craft. Immediately, he felt the coldness through to his bones, while his skin began to pulse and dapple with the energies that surrounded him. A rush of terror went through him, but also a feeling of peace. He'd done the right thing. He'd set the terms of his own death, no one else. It was only as he expelled his last breath that he saw it appear below him, colossal and terrifying. The planet around which they had been orbiting. Continents of writhing, wraith-like masses, oceans of squirming souls, all laid out before him, filling his vision in its immensity. Even through the airless distance of space, he felt as though he could hear the cries of all the dead who populated this haunted, spectral world, their voices a cacophony of agony. In his last moments, he knew that he had been tricked, that he'd condemned himself and all his crewmates to an eternity of fathomless miseries. But there was nothing now he could do. His choice had been made. He felt the pull of the planet's gravity as what remained of him left his frozen, bloated body behind and descended to the ghost planet's monstrous surface. Back on the deck of what remained of the endless wrath, no soul remained to draw breath. As the ship drifted unmanned through the great vastness of space, silence reigned.